morning, everyone. My name is Frank Jastalki, and I'm your Vice President of Intelligence at the Medical Alley Association. And I'm so pleased that you've joined us today for what will be a three-part discussion looking at the regulatory and reimbursement environment in the US, and then the regulatory environment in the EU. We are doing this in partnership with our wonderful partners at Investissement Quebec and the Quebec Government Office in Chicago, who we've had going on now a year-long partnership to support a group of companies out of Quebec bringing their innovative technologies to the largest healthcare market in the world, the United States. We've had a lot of fun, we've learned a ton of things, and we've seen some great innovations come to market. This is a part of that program series where we're bringing knowledge and insights out to the broader Quebec medical technology community so that if your company is interested in expanding global markets, you have a better base of knowledge, you have some relationships, and you know there are some people to turn to. Medical Alley is here to help you on the US side here in Minnesota, but we've also got our fantastic partners with us today. And I'm going to turn to one of them, Roch Paquette from Investissement Quebec, just to say a few words of welcome. Roch, if you would.
Bonjour, Frank. Thank you so much. Very happy to be here. Bonjour à tous et à toutes de l'écosystème des sciences de la vie du Québec. Nous sommes très heureux de vous avoir avec vous aujourd'hui dans cet atelier qui va toucher davantage sur tout ce qui est réglementation, remboursement sur les États-Unis. I'm speaking to you today from chilly Quebec City, where I will be attending the FISC, which is Quebec City's International Forum on Health, starting actually today and going on through Friday. It is an unusual year. Le FISC cette année est virtuel. It is virtual, but we really are hoping that you will have a chance at some point to come to this very interesting forum being held every month of December in wonderful Quebec City. Alors, sans plus tarder, j'aimerais remercier à tous les participants d'être là, vous dire qu'il s'agit donc des deux derniers ateliers que Investissement Québec, le Bureau du Québec, ou plutôt la délégation du Québec à Chicago et Medical Alley présentent à l'ensemble de l'écosystème québécois dans le but d'améliorer les efforts de pénétration du marché américain. So, without further ado, Frank, thank you so much for this possibility. Great partnership throughout the year, and we'll have a little word on that at the end of today's meeting. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you. A couple of quick housekeeping things as we go through the program. The program is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again afterwards or share it with some of your colleagues. If afterwards you want to get in touch with any of our speakers, we'll be happy to connect you with them, and I know they'll be happy to have a conversation. There's a Q&A function that throughout the presentations, as you have questions, just type the question right in there. I'll be moderating that, and I'll pull the questions into the presentations as appropriate and as aligned. You may not hear a response right away because we want to be able to let the speakers finish up their key points. And if we don't get to your question at this, we will capture them and follow up afterwards. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker to get us started with the first session on regulation. Turn it over to Corey Reagan from LabCorp. Corey, I'll let you take it away.
Very good. Thank you, Frank. Let me go ahead and share screen. And you just let me know once it's sharing. Does it look good, Frank?
That looks great.
Perfect. All right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Corey Reagan. I work for LabCorp. I'm a regulatory and quality systems principal advisor for them. Just a little bit about me. I've been in regulatory for about 15 years, and my background is in software. I wrote software for companies before I got into regulatory. So I really focus on digital health in the US market, mostly for regulatory. But I started off in implantable devices in the cardiac division for different companies. So my things I do outside of work, I'm an avid reader. I love to read and learn. But if I'm not reading, I'm at a hockey rink with my kids. As you'll hear, LabCorp, we're based out of Minnesota, but I recently have moved south down to the warmer states of Florida. So I get the nice sunny views and no snow, which I love, but still hockey, so all good. So today I'm just going to cover a quick overview of what FDA is all about and how to maybe get into the market in the US here. We'll go through some what I call easy steps that maybe aren't so easy. Give you a little bit of background on some trends that we're seeing, and we'll touch base on the quality aspects of things. So medical devices are regulated by the Center of Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, in the United States. So their mission is to protect and promote the public health. And they have their values and their vision out on their website. I like to pull the first two because this is really what I feel is the meat and potatoes of what CDRH is all about. They really are focused on protecting the public. So you'll see anytime we submit information to the FDA, this is their main focus. They're going to ask questions and make sure you have what they would need to say that the public would be safe to use your device. And then science-based decisions. We always say if you don't have it documented, it never happened, but you also just need to prove that things work. It's not just, well, we think we're better. You need to prove it, obviously, with science-based decisions, science-based evidence, all of that. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to do 5 easy steps that we're going to walk through to gain market in the US. We're going to identify your product, your device. We're going to confirm that it's actually a medical device. We're going to look at the regulatory pathways that are options for you. Again, that valid scientific evidence comes into play, and then what it takes to do that pre-market application. So the biggest thing is just identifying what your product is. What's it's going to be used for? What's the description of it? How is it used? What's it indicated for? What's the patient population? All of those things that we see listed here is what you need to determine your device is and does. And then once you have that defined, we're going to say, well, does that definition fit within the medical device definition? So this is pulled here from the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. This is their definition of a medical device in the United States. So if it's intended to diagnose, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease, it's going to be a medical device. So that's where on the previous slide where we talked about intended use, this is where that comes into play, is what's it intended to do? What's it intended for, and what's it intended to do? And then the other piece of the last bullet there is basically saying that it's not a drug. If it is a drug versus a medical device, that follows a whole different path. Today we'll focus specifically on medical device. But again, if you have questions on the drug side, you are welcome to reach out after the presentations and stuff as well. The other piece to confirm if it's a medical device is if there's other similar decisions from FDA. FDA has a lot of databases you can search to see if there's a similar device out there and see what they've maybe made a decision on prior to that. If they said a similar device is a medical device, your device probably is the same. All right, so this gets more into what maybe isn't such the easier of the tasks. Step 3 is we're identifying the regulatory pathway. So we've now determined the intended use. We now know that it's a medical device. Now we're going to look at the extent of the controls that are needed for your device. So we have like class 1 devices. They're usually exempt from a pre-market notification to FDA. You'll follow some general controls, some quality system requirements and things that need to be in place. But usually you can market these because they are low risk devices. The class 2 moderate risk ones are usually where a 510(k) submission is needed, where there's probably something already on the market that you can say you're just as safe and effective as, and that's usually what you would use as a predicate device to be able to submit a class 2 device. And there's sometimes special controls that are required, and we'll get into that more in just a little bit. The class 3 are high risk devices. These are your implantable devices, your cardiac devices, a lot of times fall into the high risk category. They're things that could cause, harm to a patient if not used properly. A lot of times this will need clinical data to support it. They're just the higher risk devices. So just having controls in place aren't enough to show that you're safe and effective. This is usually where clinical trial is required to really show that the device can be used safely. So we talked a little bit about the controls that are needed. So I'll go into the general and special controls now. So in general, for class 1, well, really all class devices, but especially the class 1s, they're just general controls that are needed. You're going to have to establish register your establishment with FDA. That's basically stating the site location that you now are an establishment that does something with a medical device. Whether you manufacture it, you do the design, you do the complaint handling, you will register that with the FDA. And you also list your device with the FDA and tie that to the different sites that maybe interact with that device. The quality systems piece, we'll touch again on that later on the presentation, but you want to make sure that you have the quality systems in place for your company. There's labeling, labeled devices that are medical devices, post-market reporting for any complaints. And then sometimes if you have a repair, replace, or refund as part of your device if something goes wrong, sometimes a warranty falls into there. And then, like I said, we talked a little bit about the different submissions, and the IDEs are for your clinical studies. So all those general controls fall into place depending on what class you are, but the basics of your general controls, establishment, registrations, and medical device listings, quality system, all those are applicable for all class devices. So what are the special controls? So as we talked about, the 510K and PMA might have special controls too. Sometimes there's specific standards that are required for your device. There's sterilization standards, biocompatibility standards. There's EMC, like electromagnetic standards. So different ones, depending on what your device does, might be applicable. Some is like, especially in the PMA higher risk devices, you might have patient registries or post-market requirements that are needed. There's lots of different guidance documents that FDA has out that might be specific for a unique device, whether it be a pulse oximeter or a catheter. There might be unique guidance documents that give additional requirements that those types of devices would need to meet. Some have specific labeling, and then there might be individual communications that FDA has out there. If there's safety communications FDA has done. So for example, it was a big deal a few years back on the women's mesh products that had special communications out. So there was unique requirements that were needed to be met for those to be marketed. And then the valid scientific evidence is our next step. So now we might know that which class device we are. We have our regulatory submission pathway. Now what do we need to do to support that pathway? So we're going to need our evidence, our scientific based evidence. So the CFR, that the Code of Federal Regulations, the two parts from the CFR there are listed that require evidence for safety and effectiveness. And then there are also the definition of what they, being the FDA, uses as their definition of valid scientific evidence. And that evidence can come from lots of different places. We talked about the special controls and the guidance documents that are there. But really what it comes down to is, what do you need to do to prove your device is safe and prove that your device works, that it's effective? So those are your performance that meets all of your requirements, that it meets any clinical requirements, all of those. So all of the testing, all of verification and validation, clinical, literature searches, whatever it might take to prove that your device is safe and effective for the human population to use. And then it gets into the step number 5, where we actually submit that pre-market application. There's lots and lots of different kinds of submissions that you can do with the FDA. We talked about the 510K and the PMA already, depending on your risk classification of your device. But there are other ones. FDA really recommends the use of what's called the Q submission program. This allows you to get feedback on maybe a test plan or a clinical protocol or all kinds of different things that you can go in a pre-submission that's listed there first to get that feedback from FDA before you actually submit the 510K or a PMA. It really just helps ensure that what you're going to submit is what FDA would need in order to clear or approve your device. The submission issue request is if you have a submission and FDA asks for additional information, you can use this to be able to talk through individual questions that they had, propose an action plan, really gain alignment on how you're going to respond to that additional information request. Study risk determination that can be used to determine if your clinical study would be a significant risk study or a non-significant risk study. Significant risk studies do need to be submitted through that IDE process, that investigational device exemption. A non-significant risk study usually just needs the IRB review versus having to go through FDA. So there's, I won't go through each one of these. If you have questions about them, for sure, reach out. But the breakthrough designation is a popular one lately, especially with a lot of new technologies coming in onto the market. The bar to be able to get a breakthrough designation is a lot higher than you might expect. You'll most likely need clinical data to show that you are superior to the standard of care right now. And the Safer Technologies program is kind of parallel versus instead of clinical, you're going to need to show that you're superior in your technology and how that works. The 513G is for classification to gain alignment from FDA if you're a class 2 or class 3. And the de novo that's in there, that is if they're, you would be a class 2 device like a 510K, except there's maybe not a predicate out there to show that you're just as safe and effective as. And so in that case, you would be a de novo where you would basically be the first on the market for your type of device. So what goes into a submission? Here are really the basic components. Again, we go back to that intended use. So many things play off of that intended use. And I know even later when Tom gets to speak about reimbursement, that intended use is key even for understanding the reimbursement piece. Going into your device description, having a really clear description of your device will be critical for any agency really. But with FDA, I know that when they get the submission, they don't know your device, and so they can only understand it as well as you describe it within that device description. I know we covered a lot of this testing already, as we mentioned it before. And is it applicable or not applicable? A lot of times you have to state why it is or is not applicable. So if you're not a sterile device, obviously you wouldn't need sterilization reports, but you just note that that's not applicable for your device. I will touch base a little bit specifically on software submissions because this is somewhat recent topic. I think with FDA, they've come out with a lot of guidance documents recently and just within the last month released a new one about what software documentation is going to be required for software as a medical device. So here's just kind of a list of everything in there. Now they would also need a statement of whether you would be enhanced or basic level of documentation for your device. That's per the new guidance. And then the software level of concern is really a low, moderate, or high level of concern that you would have for your device as far as the risk. Cybersecurity is a big topic with FDA right now to make sure that your software devices are not being able to get hacked into or penetrated in any way from both the software itself or over how data is transferred, whether it's encrypted, all of those play a factor. And the other thing is the interoperability of how it interacts with maybe a hardware aspect of your device, or again, with the cloud or with the user, how things interact between everything. Machine learning and artificial intelligence is becoming a bigger and bigger topic. And so there's more and more information out there that FDA has provided on this as well. But this is an area where you'll want to really get buy-in from the agency, from FDA, to really understand how often you would need to submit a new submission. If your software is learning all the time, it's always being updated, you don't want to necessarily have to submit a new submission every time it changes. So there are ways you can set that up ahead of time such that you don't need to submit every time a new, it learns, I guess, from information being provided.
Hey, Corey.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Frank. We got a couple of questions from the audience that might apply in this and your prior slide, if you don't mind.
Okay. Absolutely.
One question was about predicates, and the person was wondering, does a predicate need to be another medical device? Or they're asking, could it be an aesthetic device as well, which I would take an aesthetic device as a device, but so does a predicate need to be a medical device?
Yeah, great question. So it would need to be a medical device. And if you're doing a 510K where you would need a predicate, the other device should be, it has to be a 510K cleared device as well. And what you're doing then is showing that you're just as safe and effective as that device. And that's what FDA clears you as, to be just as safe as that device. So your data, you would compare in your submission a table basically that it would compare yourself to that predicate, and it would have to be a 510K cleared or a de novo device. Good question.
Wonderful, thank you. And then the second question is about CLIA and regulations, and it sounds like specifically around lab developed tests. And tell me if this is an area maybe not as much for you, maybe ask a different person, but the question is, how applicable or how comparable is CLIA and FDA IVD regulations?
Yeah, IVD is a whole other world that I don't necessarily do. We do have an expert on our team. And so Frank, if you wouldn't mind sending me that question, I can follow up on that answer with our expert in that IVD space. Unfortunately, I'm not able to answer that
Wonderful.
for you, but I know we have a teammate that does those for us. So
for the person who asked that question, because he had it as anonymous, please do reach out after and we'll get you connected. All right, Corey, back to you.
Perfect. And I do have my email at the end of this as well. If you can shoot it to Frank and I, that would be great. All righty, good questions. So I do have a few tips for success in here. Again, we go back to that good science, good data to support your requirements, to support whatever conclusions that you're making for your device. That intended use, that indication for use is so critical. You want to be able to show that you can support whatever you're stating your device is intended to do. Just making sure whatever you submit is nicely organized, that FDA doesn't have to go searching for it. And that's not just for FDA, that's really any agency you submit to. The cleaner you can make it, the easier it is for them to follow your pathway, your train of thought, really makes it an easier review for them. And then FDA has a lot of different forms and stuff that are required. They're no well, it's not new, but their e-copy program is where we submit it electronically. All of those are really key to make sure you have the right forms, the latest version of forms, so nothing gets kicked back to you because you're using an outdated document. So I do have this on here. There are lots of helpful FDA websites to go to. They have searchable databases. But like I said, the guidance documents, there's hundreds of them probably out there by now, to go and search for specifically something that's applicable for your device. I use, I think, all 5 of these almost daily at this point. They really are something that we use constantly with FDA submissions. So the Q submission program that I mentioned is really, that's the guidance document for the different types of submissions that I had outlined up there. So I would, if you're looking to interact with FDA prior to submission, I would definitely recommend reading through that. All right, couple just hot topics. Like I said, clinical data is a big one right now, to have that information that's needed for to support your device. COVID-19, obviously that's a worldwide issue, but what we did see a lot of delays or a lot of new submissions around COVID-19, but it did take a lot of resources for FDA to focus on COVID-19. So a lot of other types of things were delayed, but that seems to be coming back now, where they're back kind of to their normal metrics, normal review times, which is good. We talked already a lot about digital health. Emergency use authorizations, a lot of folks here in the United States are learning what that term means, because the drugs, the vaccines for COVID-19 were initially done under emergency use. And so a lot of folks are getting to learn more about that. But my biggest thing there is that if you do go for emergency use, make sure you're ready to handle complaints, anything like that, that it has been a focus of FDA to ensure all complaint handling is being reported. And I will also touch a little bit on patient diversity. So this is something that as you're testing, if you're getting usability data or clinical data, something to keep in mind is that the patients that you're collecting data from, that you have a diverse patient population. And that doesn't necessarily just mean skin color. It could mean regions, it could mean education, it could mean age. So depending on what, again, your intended use is for, you really want to make sure you have a diverse patient population that you're collecting data on. Now, I will say if you have a device for pregnant women, you get to be a little bit diverse in the sense that you are a little bit biased, I should say, that you don't need to include men in your patient study. You will only have obviously pregnant women if that's what your device is intended for. But I will make sure that there's lots of safety communications out for anything that might read through the skin, sensors, to ensure that you have all skin pigmentations covered. If it's something that you need to understand certain instructions for software devices, that you have all educations or all age groups covered that would be using your device. So, and if you ever have questions on that, again, that's a great question to reach out on as well. Some of the trends we've seen, I touched on a lot of these already, but you saw that pre-submission process again is just a big one to use as possible. Given, I'll say, the last few years with technology, we just are seeing a ton of new technologies, new things that people can do with technology today. And so that de novo pathway has been being used more and more because there's just not something like it out on the market today. There is a lot of guidances that have come out recently on the IVD. So I know somebody had a question on that. So there you can look up some of those guidances. And again, I'll follow up on any questions on IVD outside of this as well. We talked a lot about the cybersecurity interoperability for digital health. There are the consensus standards. So I will say with the US, there's a lot of standards out there that are differ between maybe what Europe would allow and what the US would allow. FDA does have a website that says what standards they accept. They're called the consensus standards. And that is something that you will want to make sure that you test to a standard that the US accepts. And so that is sometimes you might need to do different type of testing for different geographies. And total product life cycle. So this is the end-to-end from everything from your architecture to your requirements, your design, your testing. It's really making sure you document things well throughout the entire life cycle of your device. And again, we talked about the product specific guidances out there. The least burdensome initiative, this is something that FDA is really looking more into to really make sure, especially with smaller companies, that the level of information that they're requiring isn't overly burdensome. I had at one point in my career where FDA had asked for something, and when the person I was working for came back and said, well, to do that testing, it will cost our company millions and millions of dollars. And so that's why we do it this way. FDA then reconsidered that because it was the burdensome approach for the small company to be able to do that. So they will work with you depending on what the situation is, but at the same time, you do need to meet a minimum, like I said, that valid scientific evidence. You will need to supply that, but there are sometimes different ways if a certain test is just overly burdensome to do. And then if everyone's been to the FDA website or not, they have really over the last couple of years improved their website for navigation, just transparency in what they're working on. There are a lot of improvements that they've done to make it easier to navigate and see. All right, just to touch really quick on the quality system. So,
hey, Corey.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before you jump to that, we had one last question
Yeah.
that had come in. So before the quality piece, they were asking for the predicate, does it have to have the same exact intended use?
Yeah, so the closer it is, the better. A lot of times if it's the same product code and it's intended to be used the same way, that intended use can be slightly different, but then you'll want to note why the differences don't raise new questions of safety and effectiveness. So if you can find one that's super close, that's the best way to go. It raises less questions with FDA as that predicate. And again, if you're not sure, that Q submission process is the best way to go to ask FDA if I use this as my predicate, but this is what I have for my intended use that's different, is that acceptable? That is an answer that they can give back as well. Good question. All right, so the quality system, again, this is just making sure everything gets documented, that you follow a consistent process. And I, again, won't read through all of this, but just knowing what you're doing, when you're doing it, to repeat those processes. FDA will want to see that you have your quality system in place and that you have everything under control, if you will. A couple of the trends we've seen. So this is from 2020. When FDA does their inspections, they do provide a list of their findings. So you'll see a lot of the findings are about inadequate procedures on that quality system side, that maybe you're not handling complaints. The MDRs, again, that complaint procedure, lack of control. So you'll see a lot of the findings that FDA would have if they come to inspect you are all under the quality system procedures being in place. And this is from 2021, this last year up through September. Again, if you ever want to see the history, there is the link at the bottom of these slides that takes you to that list. And these two that are in blue were new ones that popped up in 2021 that jumped into the top 10, I would say. But really it's going into your accepting of devices, the acceptance activities that you have in place from like maybe your suppliers, materials that come in. What are you doing to show that that's an acceptable lot to accept? And then also investigating any device failures to make the due diligence of whether it's a return device or a failure that you found internally, getting to root cause, showing what caused it to failure. All that investigation piece of that should be well documented as well. All right, so we're going to wrap it up. I always like to throw a few key takeaways at the end of mine. So going back, always use those FDA tools, use those links to help you know what to do, when to do it, how to do it, all of that kind of stuff. Use that regulatory pathway. If you're at a 510K or a PMA, use those pathways to help guide the requirements, those special controls that are going to be needed. They'll really outline a lot of the details for you. Quality is not an option. This has to be in place. You have to do high quality work. You're working with medical devices. We don't want to cut any corners on this because of this one. Patient safety always has to come first. You know, you don't want to cut corners and have the device fail and cause harm to any person. I always say, do work as if, you know, your child or your mother or father are going to be using your device. Make sure you're doing a quality job and putting that patient's safety first. And I always say, remember that what you do matters. I know sometimes we can get down in the weeds of our everyday job, but the devices we're producing really make a difference to patients and healthcare professionals. It makes their job easier. It makes it more accurate, whatever it might do. It really makes a difference. And if you've ever had a chance to hear a patient's story of a device that impacted their life, it really can just show what an impact we have in what we do every single day. And this is my final slide on minding your P's and Q's. So this is a slang term about basically minding your manners. In the US, we kind of have it as a slang, mind your P's and Q's. Again, patients always come first. Use that regulatory pathway, prove it always with valid scientific data, high quality, follow your process and procedures, make sure your quality system is in place. And if you're not sure, just ask questions. We have lots of resources with Medical Alley is a great resource. They have all kinds of resources out there for you. And I know FDA with that program in the US has that ability to help answer questions too. Thanks so much for your time. Again, if there's additional questions, Frank, we can take them now or later. There's my contact information. And if there's anything else I can do to help anyone answer questions, I'm happy to do so.
Corey, that was fantastic. You got through all the questions. There's a couple that'll probably reach out to you with some questions that were more specific to their product and probably are better for a one-on-one conversation.
Sounds great.
So with
Thank you.
that, I'm going to hand it over to our next speaker, who's going to talk about the European side of the regulatory environment. And so, Mr. Louis Paul, if you would come on, and I'll hand it over to you and you can take it away. And Louis, it looks like we can see your screen just fine. If you want to just pop up your camera and your turn on your audio.
Yep, here I am. And I'm turning on my camera. So hello, everyone. Here we are. Okay, let's start. Hello, everyone. My name is Louis Paul Marin. I'm the CEO and the founder of a company based in Laval called LOC. Personally, I am a lawyer and an engineer. At the get-go, I'd like to say thank you to the Medical Alley and the Quebec government for allowing me to, or LOC, to be present and because I'm of the opinion that the medical device regulations, the new medical device regulations in Europe are probably the most significant change to the Europe legislation for medical devices in over 20 years. And it's very important to share our knowledge and our experiences with all stakeholders in our industry. Whoops, something is going wrong. Just hold on. Okay, I think I'm good now. If I do this, do you see a change on the screen now? Or I still remain with the...
Still on the first slide.
Okay. Why is
No
this?
worries.
Oh, hold on.
It would not be a true Zoom meeting if we didn't have some. There we go. Now it advanced.
So here we go. So in a nutshell, this is just to introduce you to Luck in a 30-second review. We're a company based in Laval, as I said. We're focusing only on medical devices, and we're 16 consultants working full-time, and we offer the full spectrum of services with respect to homologations, compliance, quality system implementation, clinical evaluations, and so forth. And we work for the Canadian, US, and European territories or jurisdictions mostly. This is my roadmap for today. I'm going to start with an overview of the key differences between the old directive and the new regulations. And then we're going to go through the main themes of the regulations. So you probably noticed my Quebec French accent. I'm sorry, I'm going to do my best so you understand everything I'm saying. And I have too many slides, but I wanted to give you as much as I could. So anyway, so bear with me, and please don't hesitate to ask any questions you may have. Let's start. So we were with the MDD for a while, and now we're moving forward to what we call the MDR, which are the medical device regulations. It's applicable right now. It's been in effect and applicable since May 26th, following a transition period, mind you. Product approvals under the former MDD can potentially remain in force for legacy devices. But most of you will have to go through the new regulations soon. So this is why I'm covering mostly the MDR under this, for the next 30 minutes. Mind you that, as you can see on this slide, the medical device regulations are now much more detailed. They contain 71 definitions. They have lots of annexes. 175 pages as opposed to 60 pages for the former MDD. The biggest difference is that the regulation is a legally binding and is enforced across all member states, which means that they are directly applicable and do not need to be transposed into national laws as it was the case with the directive. It therefore reduces the risk of discrepancies in interpretation across the EU market. Sorry, this was also introduced for several reasons. First, they wanted to restore confidence in the regulatory oversight system following several scandals. One notably with breast implants. The second reason was that they wanted to create a single approach to medical device regulations that were common across all member states. That was very important. Before, actually, rather than continue to allow for differences in interpretation and application across Europe. And finally, they wanted to keep pace with scientific and technological developments, such as modern software or other devices that collect health data. In this slide just shows you what really happened. They kind of combined former text into new ones. Here I'm going to talk mostly about the medical device regulations to the left. Yeah. So in a nutshell, also, the compliance of all devices is very important, and you have to understand that there's no grandfathering right now, which means that provisions, all the devices will have to be recertified under the MDD. So those of you who are currently selling under the MDD will have to go through this new medical device regulations. And also, you have to understand that to the extent you're still selling and working under the MDD, it means that you cannot make any significant change to your device. Otherwise, you'll have to go through the MDR process to be able to sell devices with significant changes. So that's very important to understand. So in terms of shift of focus from the former MDD, we have to understand that first, the MDR promotes the shift from pre-approval stage to a life cycle approach. This approach is similar to the life cycle view advocated by FDA or Health Canada, and also by many international standards. It elevates the responsibilities of medical device companies for their products throughout the life cycle. Focus is thus put on risk management, post-market follow-ups, really. Much greater emphasis is placed on clinical data and clinical evaluations. For example, clinical risks must be identified in the risk management file and addressed as part of clinical evaluations, and reports have to be made up every year, like post-market clinical follow-ups. Residual risks are must be addressed. Equivalence is also was commonly used, to leverage clinical data. Now it's interpreted very more stringently. It's even more stringent than the substantial equivalence with FDA, as Corey explained earlier. So there was a big shift, and as I said earlier, there's a shift on market surveillance. There's also a shift to harmonization and consolidation. In other words, what has happened is that they merge all the guidances, MedDev's guidances that were priorly used with the MDD, and they did put it all in the MDR. So it's now binding, and this change reduces the flexibility in interpretation by the industry or by the notified bodies. So it's very important. For instance, all the ISO 14155 standards, as you know, most of the requirements in these standards have been implemented within the medical device regulations. That's a big change. The last focus was to involve more economic operators in the supply chain, which means that you have now specific requirements for distributors, authorized representatives, importers, which are laid out in the medical directives. The medical device regulations. That's also a big shift, and it puts a lot of obligations now on players which were not that involved before. So having said that, and having gone through the main focus and changes, let's see now what the MDR contains and what are the main subjects that are now putting a big onus on the manufacturers. First of all, the definition of the term medical device has been broadened. You can see in my slide here that the term software has been added specifically as being amongst the main subjects other than what was before. You can see also the word disability here at the, just a bit further down, which means that it clarifies the fact that some devices for mental illness, for instance, are now bluntly incorporated into the definition of medical device. This is the second part of the definition. You can see also that cleaning, disinfection, or sterilization devices are now incorporated within the definition. So it's very clear that they are now part of, they are now considered as medical devices. I said that the definition of medical device is broadened, but mind you that it also now covers for a group of products that have no medical that are not intended for medical purpose and that are listed in an annex. I'm just going to give you some examples of devices which are not deemed to be with an intended purpose, that are not intended for, with a medical purpose, but are still listed and are deemed to be medical devices. You can think of dermal fillers, non-prescription colored contact lenses, devices intended to reduce, remove, or destroy adipose tissue, device intended for body hair removal. These are all devices which were in a gray zone before and are now clearly included and are now deemed to be medical devices. And Laurie talked a bit in her presentation about the classification of the devices in the United States. Well, in Europe, it's about it's a bit of a different way but it's similar in the thinking. They have classification of risks, which are also very important to understand. As opposed to what was in the MDD, let's say it remains essentially the same, but there's a few changes and by the addition of a few classification rules. There are now 22 classification rules. They've reclassified a few devices. So if you made an analysis under the former MDD, it might be worth redoing just looking at the new classification rules, because you might be in a different classification category under the new MDR. Just an example is the new rule for classification of software. Software can fall under any risk now, but class 1 is now being the exception. We've had the way software being described is a bit different. It refers now to software that drives a device or influences the use of a device. And it's not only a standalone product like medical software used as a medical device. So the new rule 11, which is specific for software, is now such that devices that are used in a system in combination with other devices are mostly class 2As or class 2Bs. So the point is that we've had experiences lately where devices which were or systems that were prior class 1s have now been classified in a new category. They're now class 2As, which involves a lot more for the manufacturers. So it's really worth going back to the classification process if you haven't, and to the extent you're using software in combination with your devices or your systems. That's a big change. Just to come back on what Laurie was saying earlier, if you compare now the classifications between Europe, Canada, and the US, for those of you who've been more in touch with the Canadian classifications of the US, this is how it stands. As you can see, in Europe, you have class 1s, 2A, 2B, and 3, and they're aligned with the Canadian classification schemes, and a little bit with the US, except that we have four different categories instead of having 3 like in the US. As I said earlier, the MDR extends its application to all economic operators in the supply chains. Sorry, so that makes a huge difference for a lot of people. As you can see from this slide here, MDR delineate the demarcation between the responsibility of the authorized representative, the distributors, the importers. They must, inform each other about many things that are happening in the marketplace, which is neat, but it's just these people were not involved as much in the past. So the new role and responsibilities must be really looked at, and you have to make sure whenever you're working with these people that it is currently done through contractual arrangement, but also by auditing them often. For example, the regulations describe the tasks that can be delegated by the manufacturer to the authorized representatives and the conditions under which this can take place. At the minimum, authorized representatives' obligations include verifying that the EU Declaration of Conformity and technical documentation have been drawn up, and that an appropriate conformity assessment procedure has been carried out by the manufacturer. Distributors and importers must cooperate with manufacturers or authorized representatives to achieve an appropriate level of traceability of devices. So these things are quite new. Importers also have the responsibility to inform manufacturers and their authorized representative in the event of complaints. One of the big ones I find is that distributors must now assume legal liability over products during storage and transportation, which to me causes a little bit of concern where products are shipped directly to users from the manufacturers. So these are things which must be taken into consideration when you evaluate which distributor you're going to use or how you're going to import the products within the EU. Another new concept, which I think is worth discussing, is the fact that the MDR introduces the concept of a person responsible for regulatory compliance. This role should be filled by a highly educated and experienced person and is intended to safeguard regulatory compliance within the manufacturer. Concretely speaking, it means that the conformity of the device must be appropriately checked in accordance with the quality management system under which the device is manufactured before it's released. The technical documentation, EU conformity must be kept up to date. Post-market surveillance obligations are also complied with. This is the role of that person. Mind you that micro or small enterprises are not required to have a person responsible for compliance full-time. But they must have a person permanently and continuously at their disposal. That's, to me, burdensome on some of our clients. In terms of general safety and performance requirements, well, again, a bit like it was in the former MDD, they're all laid out in a schedule. We're talking here about Annex 1. This is where they're all lined up. Understanding the general safety and performance requirements will be an important aspect here for manufacturers' transition plans from the directives to the MDR. It increases a lot the burden of the demonstration and the data that must be gathered. There's a checklist, but now you have more than 220 items to review, which is a lot, I'm telling you. And also in the big scheme, if you're familiar with harmonized standards, which is the same as recognized or consensus standards in the US, not only do you have to make sure that you meet all the general safety and performance requirements using harmonized standards, but they've also implemented like a new concept, which is common specifications. Common specs are a set of technical and clinical requirements other than a standard that provide the means of compliance with the legal obligations of a device to meet with safety and general performance requirements. It's a bit like the special controls in the US, as explained by Corey earlier. It's supposed to be implemented where no harmonized standards exist or where relevant harmonized standards are not sufficient, or where there's a need to address public health concerns. Then this is where the Commission will adopt the common specifications. To give you examples, they've already issued regulations establishing common specs for the reprocessing of single-use medical devices. Others have been published also for product without a medical purpose, the one I discussed earlier, like hair removals or colored contact lenses or similar type of devices. So they've introduced a new layer of specifications. And this is something you must consider and always evaluate on a case-by-case basis. Make sure you understand what that means when you start preparing and planning for your CE marking. With this concept, also, I think it's a way for the EU Commission to have more discretion to strengthen requirements for medical devices. So pay attention to these common specs. You know, there's a big challenge also out there to keep track of devices placed in Europe, and they've initiated to put in place some databases for that purpose. It's certainly a new and key aspect of the MDR. They have these are based on mandatory inputs as well as overall transparency. These are the two principles that were guiding the development of these databases. They're not yet ready to go, all of them. One is expected for the registration of devices, one for the registration of economic operators, notified bodies and certificates, clinical investigations, vigilance and post-market. There's also another database for UDI, unique device identifiers. But you have to follow this. It's just not ready yet to go. Some are already in place. I think it's the one for the registrars or notified bodies. And they've been late on the development, but it's something you must follow because sooner than later, it's going to become important, and it's going to be mandatory to input some of your information within the databases. Very important to note then. In terms of conformity assessment, the conformity assessment works the same way as it was under the former medical device directives. They have enacted, you have schedules which will explain in detail what's required, what are the different routes that are useful or that you may use to have to obtain your CE marking. Of course, apart from the risk classification, certain features may influence the conformity assessment procedures. For example, when a medical device is required to be sterile, if you're for medical devices, all class 2As, 2B, and 3 devices, as well as some specific class 1s, will require the intervention of a notified body. This is all described within the annexes. There's different assessment routes, but this is not that complicated. It's something that is just needs to be read and understood. And mind you that for certain devices, mostly class 2Bs and 3s, in some instances where notably for product were intended to administer or remove a medical product, it may also involve the expertise of an independent expert panel, a bit like they've done in the States with class 3s and PMA processes. So that's been also implemented. Thus far, we haven't been involved as a firm in these types of processes, but I know it's out there. It's going to come soon. One big difference is the role of notified bodies. It's probably by far one of the greatest changes brought by the MDR. The role of the notified bodies it actually moved from an industry partner into like a police-like extension of the competent authorities, market surveillance apparatus. In the past, there's been concern expressed about the lack of details in the MDD on the roles of the notified bodies. Now it's very detailed. It's out there. It's listed. They have also certain guidances or directives that were published on their roles, how they were evaluated, and so forth. So this is this plays also a big role to the extent that a lot of registrars have now left the market, which means that there's only a few now offering the service, and well, it means that you have long queuing times before you can actually book one to audit and provide you the services to obtain your CE marking, and it's now become a bottleneck. And because mind you that the role has been extended to a point where they can also conduct some unannounced audits. So the role has now been increased by a lot. In terms of quality systems, it's now and been mandatory. ISO 13485 is key again. So I invite you to read a lot on this and make sure that it's implemented, and that you implement it with a way where you can you really be concretely using it for the purposes of making all your follow-ups. Post-market is also key. And you have to always be able to make a link between your risk analysis, your risk management file, all your post-market surveillance studies, post-market follow-ups. This has to be really tight and really linked to one another. And this is why the quality system requirements are now been, I'd say, scrutinized a lot more. And I just been involved in an audit just last week, and there was a lot asked on, how the complaints were recorded, what came out of certain processes where we had to analyze the risk and make sure that what has happened in the market, the data that we had collected in the post-market surveillance with the post-market surveillance had been reviewed and analyzed vis-a-vis the risk management file and the risk analysis. It's been really, really reviewed to the extent needed. I find it's good, but you have to be prepared. You have to have a system in place which is very practical, and that you need to make sure that you follow, and you can show that you followed all of your procedures thoroughly. Post-market surveillance is obviously, as I mentioned many times, becoming more and more of a requirement, and it's more detailed. It becomes a key. It becomes a key feature under the MDR, which means, again, risk determination, management, performance evaluation data. Each device for each manufacturer are required to plan, establish, document, implement, maintain, and update really a post-market surveillance system intended for gathering and analyzing information with the aim of deciding about preventive and corrective actions. It becomes key here. It's going to be, to me, one of the central parts of the new MDR. For instance, new periodic reports, which we call PSUR in our language, are required now. They're very detailed. Even for class ones, you need to have some post-market surveillance reports written. This post-market surveillance report, PSUR, whatever, they need to be provided to the authorities, competent authorities, under certain conditions, the same as we do in Canada now. By the way, there's not a lot of guidance as to how to write these reports. So what we've done lately, we've used the Canadian guidances for periodic safety update reports and adapted it for the European market, and it worked. If you want to have some details, I would actually tell you to look at the Canadian guidance, because the system that's been implemented in Canada is a bit similar to the European for that purpose. So it's a good point to go back and see it. I don't know if you knew this, but I think it's important you know that if you have to have a little bit of guidance as to how to write these reports, it might be nice to look at the Canadian guidances where it's explained and there's a lot of details to how to write them. So again, post-market surveillance is key. I want just to repeat again, because it's really, really important to consider that at the get-go. Clinical evaluation is key, as it is in other jurisdictions. Corey made sure that she would point out in her presentation that it would be needed in certain instances, mostly for de novo or PMAs. In Europe, it becomes also a part of the CE marking process. It's, as I said, also ISO 14155, which is one of the key standards in our industry for clinical evaluation, has now been implemented within the MDR. Equivalent being more difficult, you can look into this closely, because you will probably be required to show some clinical data to be able to go through your CE marking. We've been having a lot of difficulties with the equivalence principle. It's becoming very, very cumbersome to show that your device is equivalent to another one in the marketplace. So look for obtaining more and more data. For people that are still selling in Europe under the former MDD, please jump on and make sure that you can make a lot more follow-ups in the marketplace, obtain a lot of data from your post-market clinical follow-ups, and make sure that you can gather a lot of data from these follow-ups before you are forced to go under the MDR. It's very important, and these data will be key whenever you have you come in at a point where you have to go through the MDR. Without these data, you may be forced to stop the selling and just gather more data before you can go back and have a reassessment of your whole file. What's next? As I said, you can in Europe, it's now becoming more difficult. There's more rigor into the process. You will need more and more clinical data before you can get your own CE mark in Europe. Post-market surveillance and clinical follow-ups are key. A lot of you will have to change your notified bodies because a lot are quitting the market. But mind you that the role of a notified body has changed a lot. The role is now becoming more of a police-like type of role. And it's very more detailed and very more, and there are a lot more into what they can do, what they cannot do. And this is really now becoming, I'd say, more and more difficult to go through the process if we compare with what and how it was under the former MDD. I'd say that now going through the CE marking process in Europe is now very similar to going through the Canadian or the US regulatory processes. Analyze the new requirements of the NDR in time. Make sure you know exactly where you're going first. You need a lot of personnel to be devoted to that task now. And clinical data, evaluation of the data being key. Please make sure you understand what you need beforehand, because I'm just repeating again. I know I'm repeating myself all the time, but this is something which is key now. I'd say make sure you understand what ISO 13485 is, specifically for those coming out of the US. I know it's a bit different from what you're used to with the 21 CFR and 820. The economic operators' roles are now changed, as I explained. There's going to be a lot of key contractual things to be added to the contract. So it means that you may have to reopen a lot of contracts with your distributors, with your authorized representative to cover for the new requirements. Monitor the guidances. There are new ones enacted from time to time, and it's the only way to make sure that we truly understand what is the meaning of the new regulations, and plan for long queuing times in terms of regulatory strategy. You can, just to give you an insight, right now we're trying to get some dates for some of our clients, and it may take even up to a year in certain instances before we can fix a date for a registrar to come in. It's very important to know this because it may change a lot when time to market is very important. Understand that technical file assessment is now done in a depth not experienced so far. A lot of people that have been through the process before actually not prepared well enough, and that's been a problem. What else should I add? Oh yeah, well, make sure, as I said, you need some people for smaller or micro enterprises. As I said earlier, you may need to have someone appointed specifically to handle all your medical device files and all your quality assurance matters. This is key, and it might not be easy to find one for that purpose. So I would be on my toe and I'd be starting looking if you're contemplating getting into the European market soon. What else? I see the time passing by. Other than that, I think I'm done unless you have any other questions. I think I've covered it all. I mean, the big changes in Europe have been highlighted. So if you have any questions, I'm open to any of your questions.
Louis Paul, thank you. That was fantastic. We haven't had any questions come in, but I see your contact information is on there. So I would encourage folks, if you do have questions, please do reach out either to Louis Paul directly or get in touch with us and we'll put you in touch with him. And with that, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen and we'll bring Tom up for the last presentation of today. We're going to talk a little bit about reimbursement. So you've got your product approved, but can you get your product paid for? A very important thing. And we'll just give it a second to get the screen share up. There we go. And Tom, with that, I will hand it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Frank. And thanks, Medical Alley, for hosting this presentation. And to Angie, you as well, who's going to be helping me with my slide deck. Just move on to the first one briefly, Angie, backwards, please. Can you go back to the first slide? Thanks. So just a brief introduction. My name's Tom Hughes. I'm a Senior Principal Advisor for Health Economics and Reimbursement for LabCorp. LabCorp is a large multinational corporation, but they also have a medical device division. And Corey and I are both members of that. And we offer clinical, regulatory, that's Corey's world, and I oversee health economics and reimbursement. I'm headquartered here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is a hotbed for medtech. That's why Medical Alley's here. A lot of medical device companies. And as I said, and Corey said, Medical Alley is a great resource for you folks if you want to find out more about how to enter the US market. I think I already said this. I've been here for 25 years in the medical device industry, the last 10 years in clinical research organizations, the last 5 years with LabCorp. And so I've worked in a lot of different therapeutic areas. And so this presentation, we're going to talk about a US device, which includes IVD reimbursement, US only. As Frank said, it's a multifaceted healthcare system here. So there's a lot to know. Next slide, please, Angie. So today I am going to spend about 30 minutes and I'll save some time for Q&A if there's follow-up with any three of us afterwards. So today what I'm going to do is give you the high-level overview of the Reimbursement 101 in the United States, understanding the basics, and then telling you a little bit about those three elements of reimbursement, and then moving on to giving you some idea of how to think through a reimbursement strategy and the value of a new technology, why that's important nowadays. Next slide. Thanks. Okay, so to succeed in the United States on the reimbursement level, as Frank said, you have to understand three things about your technology or services that you plan to bring into the US market. And well, the first question is, will the government or private payers cover it? What are the codes that are relevant? And how's it going to be paid? And who's going to bill for the technology? Oftentimes it's a hospital, physician, or home supplier. The answer to these three questions are going to be the answer to your sales questions when you're starting to develop your early stage technology. Next slide, please, Angie. All right, so there's a lot to know about reimbursement, and it's not as clear cut as what Corey and Louise Paul said about the regulations. I'll get to that in a little bit. But if you take nothing away from my presentation, I'm going to throw a lot at you in about 30 minutes, take this concept away. And I get this a lot. I talked about 2 or 3 startups a week for introductory calls. And Corey and I had a call this morning with a company from Europe. They said, we are wondering about reimbursement. We're wondering about a code. And I said, well, code is one element of reimbursement, but you need 3 elements to have true reimbursement to support the 3-legged stool. That's what I'm going to talk about here for the first part of my session: coverage, coding, and payment. Those are the 3 elements. If you don't have those 3 elements, what you have is self-pay. Somebody's going to pay out of their pocket, a patient, most likely, for the technology or the service that you're trying to get into the US market. That can be okay for many companies and a startup. Sometimes that's what you get off the ground in the United States. But it's probably not a good long-term strategy for yourselves or the company you want to, some companies, startups want to sell their company to a bigger one. So it's good to help them understand what this reimbursement glide slope is in the United States for your product. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a really quick high-level overview of what these terms mean. The first element is a decision. Coverage is the decision by a payer, and I'll tell you what payers are in a minute as to whether they're going to decide, am I going to cover this or not? And it varies by payer. We'll get into that. Coding is the next element. It's a language of billing. It's a very complex system in the United States. I think Canada has some of these similar codes, but the US, I'm speaking only for the US, I'll get into those different coding descriptors here in a minute. And there are multiple systems depending on where care is provided. And then if you have coverage and code, the next final issue is payment. Will, and if so, how much will a stakeholder, a payer, or a hospital purchaser pay for your technology? And there are multiple payment systems. I'll briefly describe that. They're complex, they are distinct. And so it's important to have an understanding of these If you haven't touched coverage, coding, and payment before with your technology, don't feel too bad. Many companies haven't. But if you at least understand that there are 3 elements to reimbursement, you're ahead of the game compared to before my presentation. Next slide, please. Coverage first. This is the few slides on coverage. So to have coverage, you have to understand who the US payers are. And these are the US payers in the United States. We have a private market here, which consists of some for-profit or nonprofit companies that offer coverage to most of Americans under the age of 65. The big examples are Blue Cross plans, Humana, Aetna, United Healthcare, some of the largest in the United States. I myself am covered by a Blue Cross plan, for example. Other people are covered by other private health plans. It's an employer-based system. It's started 50 years ago, and it's still in existence in the United States. We're not a quasi single payer or a single payer like some parts outside the US. In Canada, I know is more of a quasi single payer, for example. And then the other critical big payer in the United States is the Medicare system for people over the age of 65 or disabled Americans. Their Medicare program is under the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. You'll hear me talk a little bit more about that. And then there are other payers that some companies may be aware of because that may be a target market for them for workers' comp. If you're injured, your technology helps injured patients like some workers. That's a different system than the ones I've just described. Pain technology for people who have pain, for example, may have a company may want to go through the workers' comp system. Then you have Medicaid for the for the poorer Americans, they can get it through the state programs, and then military, we have active military and vets. But critically here is that 4th bullet there, that payers are going to cover services that they find them medically necessary. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a little while as well. But it's essentially a decision under Medicare is set forth in statute. Other private payers can decide to adopt the Medicare guidelines for coverage or not. They're private organizations, so they don't have to follow Medicare. And then if they don't have enough evidence, and you've heard Corey talk about evidence, it's the same for reimbursement. It's all about the evidence. And if you have evidence to show that it's medically necessary, great. If you don't, they'll consider it experimental or investigation will not have coverage, even though you may have a code and payment attached to that code. The definitions of all these things vary by payer, which I've already said. Next slide, please. All right. Thank you, Angie. Okay, what do payers want? What are they thinking about when they say, show us the evidence that it's covered? Well, first and foremost, as Corey said, and Corey and I often work together on certain technologies because, as she said, they're hand-in-hand issues. They want to know if a technology has been cleared or approved by the FDA. Cleared means you've gone through the 510(k). Approval means you have a pre-market approval, depending on the risk of your technology. That's foundational and fundamental. But beyond that, it's not just good enough to get through the FDA on their evidence to show other stakeholders in the payer market. You're going to have strong clinical evidence or supporting evidence from similar technologies to show that it's medically necessary. Of course, the stronger the design of your trial, if you have to do trials, the better chance of coverage. It's preference for peer-reviewed. And then that you have to show the treatment is beneficial, of course, just like you have to show it's safe for the FDA. Cost effectiveness is a key issue. I'll talk about that in a little bit because 20 years ago, payers and other purchasers of healthcare didn't care as much about the cost. They just paid for it. We have a volume-based healthcare delivery system in the US, but that's changing dramatically over the past 10 or 15 years since implementation of the Affordable Care Act under President Obama. And then also critically, you have to have support from physician and professional societies. Oftentimes I talk to companies, they have a representative inside the US who knows their technology and be a champion for them, for example. And a lot of companies will do marketing surveys that say, boy, there's a great market inside the US. Put yourself in the shoes of a payer, especially a private payer that has to watch, even Medicare has to think about costs and that sort of thing. So we don't lead with overutilization. You lead with effectiveness to a payer. I know you have to make those points, and there is great market opportunity, and those are market strategies critical, but consider your audience is what I'm saying here. Next slide, please. All right. I've talked a little bit about who the payers are, what they want, and this is an important slide because I talk to a lot of companies and they often confuse the issues here sometimes. What the FDA wants and what payers want are essentially separate and distinct. So if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that Corey's already gone through this quite well as to who the FDA is and the fact that they want safe and effective technologies. And they're going to look at the data, as she said, it's all valid evidence, valid data to show that that is safe and effective. You can get through the FDA, you can show that it's safe and effective, and that's foundational and that is critical. But I compare it, I use an analogy oftentimes when I give these presentations. Getting through the FDA is like getting to come into the United States, which is again foundational, but you're on the sidelines unless you're self-pay. If you want to score points and be successful and help patients and make your money, you want it to be used. To be used, you have to have reimbursement. To have reimbursement, you have to move to the right side of the screen and show payers, which are Medicare and private payers, that the technology improves outcomes versus the existing alternatives. You can use some of that evidence that you get to show the FDA it's safe and effective, excuse me. But also it's wise as you're developing, especially if it's an extension clinical trial for the FDA, to consider some secondary endpoints for these stakeholders on the right-hand side of the screen. And that can include evidence to get Medicare to pay for an IDE study if it's high risk enough. It's also evidence you can use down the road to show other payers that there is evidence on cost effectiveness and value of your technology beyond what the FDA wants. You can bake those data points into a clinical trial. It's important to think about early on. And then as far as purchasers, that bottom square there on the right, when I use the word purchasers in this example, I'm talking about hospital inpatient systems where a patient stays more than 24 hours. That hospital will buy the technology from the manufacturer or other sources and then use it on a patient, and then they will in turn bill the payer. So that's what that example is about. That's the essential difference between the FDA and what I'm talking about regarding reimbursement. However, as Corey also said, I just want to linger on this slide a second more, because when I'm helping companies with reimbursement, I want to know what, as Corey said, and as soon as possible, what that indication is for that technology that Corey and others like her and Louise Paul will work on to understand what that is. And so once we have that, we will, it'll direct me to my understanding of what I have to look for as far as reimbursement. Angie's moved on to the next slide. This is a very, I could spend a long time on this. I'm not going to, but my point here is not to help you understand this at a deep level. But as you're looking at this slide, you may ask yourself, okay, what codes are relevant to my technology? And what does Tom mean by these different types of coding systems here, which I'm going to go through right now? There are three essential big buckets of coding systems. The first one is the current procedure terminology codes. They are created by a very powerful healthcare stakeholder, the American Medical Association of Physicians. And these are codes that are used by physicians or PTs or OTs or other healthcare professionals. If they're listed as a code that's been obtained previously, they are used to identify services and procedures that are used in the clinic, which is an office setting when you go to see Dr. Jones on your annual physical, or used in an inpatient when a doctor performs surgery. I've given you an example of one code only of probably thousands of codes in the CPT manual created by the AMA, and that's a 33213. It's a 5-digit code, and it talks about insertion of a pacemaker. Medtronic is a medical device company located in Minnesota, one of the largest in the world, standalone, and they make these pacemakers. That's probably something that would be billed by a physician to insert one of these pacemakers. Very important critical code if your technology is a service provided by these professionals. You want to know, is there a CPT code applicable to my service? The second big category that's growing in importance is HCPC codes, healthcare common procedure codes. They're created and controlled by CMS. They're alphanumeric, as you can see on the right, and they describe supplies, devices, or drugs or services not defined in CPT. Durable medical equipment, more and more people are going home and they want orthopedic or other products that they take home with them, or services, sometimes software technology, digital technology, can be billed pursuant to a HCPC code, and more people are getting that type of care. That's why I said this is becoming HCPC codes are becoming more relevant, I would say. And there, an example on the far right is a HCPCS code for an external electrocardiogram product that can be used in schools and other settings. If somebody has a heart issue, they just pull it off the shelf and stimulate the heart. The lower row is ICD, International Classification of Diseases and Procedures. This is international, so Canada and Europe and other countries will use these. The US uses them. There are two subsets. There's diagnosis codes and procedure codes. Anytime a patient sees a doctor, they get diagnosed. There are thousands and thousands of these new codes under the new ICD-10 system. And procedure codes are used in the inpatient hospital setting to work with to identify the procedure being performed. And you can see examples on the far right. So these are the critical coding systems that a company has to understand whether or not their product fits into one of these coding categories, existing codes. If it's not, you have to get a new code. Your first job is to find out if there's an existing code. It's a much easier path to reimbursement, but there are paths to get new codes, new CPT, new HCPCS codes like that. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just a summary of what I just talked about. I'm not going to dwell on this. I'll just leave it up for a second here so you can understand it. I guess I bring you down to the lower two rows and tell you when they're updated and who controls, who's the owner of these codes. And I've already talked about the purpose and who uses them. We'll talk a little bit about use in a minute. So next slide, please, Angie. Okay, I've just gone through coverage. I've just spent a few minutes on coding, which is critical. And again, my goal is not to teach you all these coding elements, but to just let you know that they vary and that there are multiple coding systems. Next, a very critical leg of the three-legged reimbursement stool is payment. Payment is a process driven by coding and the site of care. So I've identified the site of cares and what codes are used on those various sites of care in the United States. Oftentimes that you can have the same code at a different site will mean different payment amounts. Let's take the first column, the physician world. Physicians offer services in all sites of care. Let's take the clinic example. If it's done in a clinic where you're in and out after a visit with the physician for various reasons, they evaluate and manage your care, whatever you're in for to see them for, they will find a CPT code. Their billing people will identify a CPT code. As I said, there are thousands of these type of codes. And then they will apply a fee to that. Now, Medicare has an established fee that's a fee that's public. Private payers keep it confidential between themselves and the payer. They don't want to share the fees that they're giving, pricing that they have with the physician with their competitors. So when I help a company identify what the CPT fee schedule is, I'll go to the Medicare fee schedule and then you extrapolate from there. A lot of private payers will follow Medicare's CPT fee schedule. Next column is hospital outpatient, where a patient, or an ambulatory surgery center where a patient is in and out in less than 24 hours, but they're in there for some brief, fairly easy surgery or something like that. Those facilities are using CPT codes as well. But under Medicare, a lot of private payers are saying we've historically spent too much on these billing for individual CPT codes. We're going to wrap them up into an ambulatory payment classification and pay that way. And a lot of private payers will follow that. Then move on to the third column, hospital inpatient, are for stays of more than 24 hours. They have a unique system. That's why I spent a few minutes on ICD-10 codes. The ICD-10 codes are used by hospital systems to bill the payers and CMSs of the world for the stay of their patient, and their procedure and diagnosis codes are wrapped up into one system for Medicare called a diagnostic related group of payment. For example, if you have a coronary artery bypass procedure, I think Medicare may pay around $30,000. That would include payment for everything from the nursing care, anesthesia, surgery, the stay in the hospital, all of the supplies and equipment that may be used as part of that. If you have a technology that's going to be used in this site of care, it's going to be wrapped into that DRG. So you have to make your case to the hospital system first, and that's usually some cost effectiveness argument. That's Medicare. A lot of private payers, however, do follow the DRG path, but they may have other payment mechanisms, sometimes case rate per diem. I'm not going to spend time talking about. The fourth row is becoming more important. I say home, but it's anytime it's not in one of the facilities to the left of the screen there. And they use HCPCS codes. I've given you some examples of durable medical equipment. You're walking down the street and you see somebody with a really fancy orthopedic brace on their knee. That was probably had a HCPCS code assigned to it and was paid that way. And that's a HCPCS fee schedule created by Medicare. And a lot of private payers will pay a little less than the Medicare pays for HCPCS. Next slide, please. I'll be done in about 7 minutes. I'm getting toward the end of my primary goal here, which is understanding basic reimbursement. So this is something that I've just talked a little bit about. You can read those bullets as I'm going quickly over it. I just told you Medicare is where we get our data from, and it's public because we're a taxpayer and they have to make it public. Private payers do not. And so that's what this slide's about. That bottom bullet is important because, as I said, for CPT codes, they'll pay, a private payer will pay more than what the Medicare fee schedule says oftentimes. Next slide, please. Before I get into the strategy here, I just want to give you one example of how coverage coding and payment works. It's a quick example of a real world experience I had with a neuromuscular stimulator. It was a HCPCS code. It was used for treating women with incontinence. It was automated Kegel technology. And this happened 15, 20 years ago when I worked with a company here in Minnesota. They said, great news, we got a code from Medicare for a HCPCS code. So we're on our track to reimbursement. And they brought me in and said, we found out Medicare gave us a code, but they denied reimbursement because they said there's not enough evidence. Going back to what Corey said about the FDA, the same is so true for reimbursement. Prove it, show us that it works. You got a code, but you're not going to get paid for it. And we're not going to sign payment for it until you show some study evidence. Went back and did a study at Northwestern. It was a well-designed trial. They accepted that, and now there's coverage coding and payment for this technology. Okay, now we're moving on to an effective reimbursement strategy. You understand, okay, I understand, Tom, you told me about coverage coding and payment. What do I do next with that information, or how do I, as a startup company, think about that? So that's what these few slides are about. Next slide, please. All right, so this is one of my favorite movies. It's called Field of Dreams, about a farmer's favorite professional baseball team that comes out of the corn patch. And me remember the phrase, if you build it, they will come. So I'm probably dating myself, but that's what this slide's about. And my answer to that question is, it may work for Field of Dreams and baseball players coming out of the cornfields, but if you turn to the next slide, Angie, it may not work for your brand new technology. And companies are, as Corey said, and I applaud startup companies, it's critical that you develop earth-breaking, innovative new technology. And that's where all the advancements in healthcare come from: new drugs, new technology, new ways of treating people. And we're in a wonderful time in healthcare. But you got to realize, I've seen this before. I've seen a lot of new technology companies are very proud of that have gotten through the FDA, and they're collecting dust, quite frankly, because they did not answer this question. You have to show the stakeholders. You have to show the payers of the United States. You have to show the purchasers, the hospitals, that it's worth paying for. That's what we're going to go through right now. Next slide. How do you do that is the question. So when do you do it? First of all, is the first question. I'll get into the how in the next slide. So I use this analogy a lot, and I think Corey and Frank have heard this before. If you went to a major investment conference 10 years ago, it's JP Morgan Investment in San Francisco. It's one of the largest in the world. Large and small investors are there, large and small drug companies, device companies go there to meet people and figure it out. If you had to talk to them, investors 15 years ago, the first question out of their mouth would have been, have you figured out the regulatory path for your technology? As you've heard from Corey and Louise Paul, that regulatory path is now pretty well set with all these exceptional guidance documents and code of federal regulations. A lot of it's in black and white. Now the investors are asking more and more firsthand, great, we understand if you get enough support from us, there will be an identification of the regulatory path with your pre-sub and all of that. Now we really, as cost containment becomes more of a critical issue in this brave new world we're in, we want to understand how you're going to get paid for it. Why am I telling you all this? Because 10 or 15 years ago, companies used to start thinking about reimbursement at the launch phase. And I got a call like that today with Corey. They'd already gone through the FDA trial. Quite honestly, I think they should have contacted us sooner. And their main question now is they realized they didn't understand US reimbursement, and now they're trying to play catch up. I would have probably told them, if you had started a little earlier, you may have been able to bake in some secondary reimbursement or health economic endpoints into that trial you already produced for the FDA. So that's a critical takeaway. So what is the purpose of this slide? Sooner rather than later is at least the time to start talking about your reimbursement strategy. How do you do that? Next slide. Okay, there's a lot on this slide. Let's stay primarily with that first rectangle. What we all often do, and other clinical research groups or internal companies will do this if they have the reimbursement resources, is the first thing you're going to do is understand what a snapshot of the current US reimbursement landscape. So it's, for my purposes, it's oftentimes a report, sometimes a memo. If it's a report, it's anywhere from 10 to 25 pages, depending on the complexity of the technology. And you're going to try to answer as the best of your ability all those questions I raised with coverage, coding, and payment. What is the coverage status for my technology with these payers? What possible codes are in various sites of care? How does payment work? What are the competitors doing with proposed technologies? What have we seen there with their attempt to get coverage, coding, and payment? And that report will usually come up with some findings and recommendations as to what you have to do next. That's that second rectangle. And from that, you develop a strategy to move ahead with getting your product into the marketplace and paid for. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just an example of a strategic plan that a company may follow. I do think that that first row is critical for anybody, even for startups, taking some time and effort and resources to figure out what the landscape does look like for your technology. Investors will ask you that, I'm almost certain of it. And then you have to build your expertise either internally or externally, and you see all those other rows. I'm not going to go through them, but I do think it's important that you start that in the product development phase, and there may be other aspects of reimbursement that can come in a later phase. Next slide, please. All right, we've just gone through the strategy that I've suggested for thinking through this. What are my 2 points there? Start as early as possible. And I would just say, and I think there was some comment maybe after the FDA analysis, I would say at the same time you're trying to figure out the indication for use, you should be working with somebody on the reimbursement team. It may still follow the FDA work, but get somebody involved in the initial conversation for a reimbursement path as soon as you're starting to think of the IDUs, intended use for your new technology, for the reasons Corey mentioned in her presentation. So now we've moved on to from understanding coverage, coding, and payment, developing a strategy, which usually involves some sort of initial assessment, and then moving on to a plan based on that assessment, to just giving you a higher level overview of why that's so important in this new healthcare environment. Next slide. And the key word here is value. You're seeing it in every country of the world. In the old days, you used to show just clinical value is good enough. Now it's also economic because of the cost of healthcare. A brief anecdote, Kaiser Permanente, one of the most respectable private organizations as far as producing healthcare data. They're also a payer and a provider, actually. But go to the Kaiser website, they have a little good data on what's going on in the US healthcare system. And they came out to report a year or two ago saying that the rate of growth and cost of healthcare is going to amount to 23% of the GDP by 2022, next year. That's almost a quarter of all gross domestic product in the United States is going to be healthcare based. We cannot sustain that. So what's that to you folks? If you have a technology, you better show those stakeholders, the purchasers and payers, that you have a great widget or service, and that it has not just good clinical outcomes, i.e. it's better than existing technology, but our economic value is there too. Next slide, please. Okay, I just define these two terms. With FDA, you're showing safety and effectiveness. With the stakeholders, payers and purchasers, you're showing clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness. Demonstrate your technology is equal to or better than what's already out there, and that the cost is comparable or better than the effectiveness of your product is going to help save costs in the system, hopefully. Next slide. All right, this is a table that's informative. You want to be in the purple in the lower right. You want to have high effectiveness and low cost. Can't always be there. So if you're equivalent or in the light blue squares, great. You do not want to be in the dark blue, not cost effectiveness squares. And you want to identify, and your question is how to identify that. You can do some economic modeling for hospitals. We do that. As I said, a lot of companies do that. There are experts out there. I oversee health economics, which is the cost effectiveness side of the reimbursement paradigm. But I have health economists that do that. I'm not a health economist, so I know enough about it though to get the experts in, and other companies can do it as well. But if you're, it can be a good way to show the cost effective of your technology. And sometimes you need it right away and other times you don't. Next slide. Okay, how and when is these economic value analysis used? The type are often economic modeling. It can be a simple model or a more sophisticated model depending on the situation, but the goal is to show a payer that this is cost effectiveness, is cost effective, this technology, or making a case to hospital systems. You can show them, well, if you use our technology, you can actually replace your existing service under the diagnostic related group of procedures and cares and use us and reduce patient stay or return to the hospitals, problems like that can exist, adverse events, things like that. You're trying to show the benefit of your technology. And then you're showing defensible pricing. There can be various reasons. These are just some examples. We're almost done here. Next slide, please. Okay, here are my final thoughts. So to wrap everything up, one thing I found in the 25 years I've been doing this is that each one of you has a somewhat unique, even though you may be similar to other technologies and products and services, you have unique opportunities and challenges. They're constantly changing. As Corey said, I've been talked about this so much. If you're a digital product, I spent a lot of time in the last year working on reimbursement issues for digital telehealth, remote patient monitoring. There's a lot going on in CMS right now. It's constantly changing. They're coming out with a brand new policy in January of this year. And there's a lot of additions and new coding information on that and coverage information from Medicare, which private payers may sometimes adopt. Often companies are totally unaware of the barriers. They're focused so much they have to do, like you folks, product design, FDA path. They sometimes forget about the reimbursement issues. I'm encouraging you to think about this early as possible and talk to somebody about what challenges and opportunities exist for your specific product. It's got to be a priority as that last bullet. I'm not just saying that out of self-interest. I've seen it too many times where if you start early, you can learn a lot and investors are going to ask you that. So without that, I think we have my closing slide where you can reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions. That's it, Frank. Thanks, Angie.
Thank you, Tom. And we had one question that came in, which was just, can manufacturers look up in advance which codes they could apply to their devices, or does that need to be done by someone else?
Great question. Oftentimes when I do an initial call, and I know Corey and I get on these calls quite a bit, we do introductory calls with companies that want to ask some of those questions one-on-one. If they don't want to share it with everybody else, we can take those calls. And there's no charge for that, of course. But I'll often get a call from a company saying, I looked up this on Google. I think I have a code. And my answer is, that may or may not be the right code. So I would say you don't know that for a fact, and there are thousands of these type of codes in all of these paradigms, whether it's DRG, ICPICS, or CPT. I would not depend totally on a code, and coding alone is not going to do it for you. It may or may not be the right code, and you also have to have coverage and payment attached to it. So I'd say you can look it up. It doesn't hurt to do that initially, but you need an expert to answer your question, Frank. Somebody who knows what they're doing to help you figure that out.
Right on, thank you. And I will just, before handing it back to Rod, I will quickly echo that. I have had the experience of working with companies that didn't do that, tried to do it on their own, got to the end of the line and realized they had FDA clearance, but they did not have coding coverage or payment in the way they thought. And They had to go back to the starting line. And so what they thought saved them a little bit of money and time cost them a couple of years and may cost the business. So yeah, that's well worth getting the insight. Tom, thank you so much as always. Fantastic presentation. Rock, I'm going to hand it over to you to wrap us up.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you to all our participants today that joined this workshop. A special thank you to the presenters. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Louis-Paul, and thank you, Tom. Not only was all these topics super interesting and really to the point, but the fact that you remain available for questions and to help and to address a few of the doubts some of the Quebec companies may have in regards to reimbursement and FDA approvals is greatly appreciated. One thing I must add, reimbursement, FDA approval are key factors to penetrating the US market with medical devices. But we have seen and heard in past workshops with Medical Alley that it's quite important to do all these things in parallel. You don't do the FDA, then you say you stop, we'll do the reimbursement, and then we'll work on our marketing and getting our KOLs, key opinion leaders. A lot of this has to be done all in parallel, or else in 10 years, you might be marketing your product. So these workshops have been really eye-openers in the sense that do go get the expert, do go get some help. If you try to do this on your own, you probably will shoot yourself in the foot, as we say. Allez voir des experts. On vous a présenté LOC Amérique du Nord. Vous avez la chance de rencontrer Tom Hughes et Corey Reagan qui sont ici. Reach out, see what your primary concerns are. And once again, thank you so much for having participated in this workshop. We have another one coming up tomorrow afternoon. And we hope to see as many enthusiastic participants then. Thank you so much. Frank?
Rock, thank you so much. Folks, that wraps us up. Fantastic discussion. This was recorded. It will be available. As Rock said, if you have questions, reach out. We look forward to being of service, and please have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us. See y'all.